They say the most powerful silence is not the silence you hear, but the silence that appears when you finally stop caring. When the emotional pull that once kept you focused on an avoidant person begins to fade, the entire relationship dynamic can change. The energy that once connected you starts moving in a completely different direction. For a long time, they may have felt secure, knowing you were still there. Even when you were hurt, your attention reassured them that they still had a place in your emotional world. It may not have been a conscious attempt to control you. Your continued care simply became something they could rely on while avoiding their own fears. But when you stop chasing, stop reacting, and stop trying to keep the connection alive, that familiar structure begins to disappear. What unsettles them is not necessarily the loss of the relationship itself. It is the loss of the predictable emotional system they had become accustomed to. Avoidant people can crave distance while still wanting the comfort of knowing someone is waiting for them on the other side of that distance. As long as you continue reaching, hoping, and caring, they know the connection still exists. But when you stop waiting, uncertainty enters the picture. Suddenly, they have no clear idea where they stand with you. That can create a powerful internal conflict. They may have used emotional distance as a way to feel safe, but now that same distance starts feeling like rejection. The silence they once controlled becomes a silence they cannot control anymore. And this is where something interesting can happen. The person who once disappeared may suddenly reappear. They might send a casual message, bring up an old memory, ask how you've been, or say something that sounds like closure, but quietly opens the emotional door again. From the outside, it can look like affection has finally arrived, but sometimes the deeper motivation is simply reassurance. They want to know whether they still matter to you. They may test your reaction without directly asking for anything. They might act detached while finding subtle ways to get your attention. They could mention memories you shared, hint that they regret certain things, or show just enough emotion to make you wonder whether they have finally changed. This creates one of the most confusing patterns in avoidant relationships. When you care deeply, they create distance. When you finally detach, they suddenly become interested. But that doesn't automatically mean they are ready for genuine intimacy. Sometimes, what pulls them back is the fear of becoming irrelevant in your life. Your attention once gave them emotional reassurance. Your patience told them they were still important. Your continued presence allowed them to avoid confronting the possibility that they could truly lose you. When that reassurance disappears, their emotional defenses can become unstable. They may suddenly become softer. They may talk about missing you. They may admit that they were scared, confused, lonely, or unable to handle the closeness between you. Because these words are so different from what you experienced before, they can feel incredibly powerful. You may think, maybe this is finally the version of them I was waiting for. And sometimes, genuine change is possible. But vulnerability by itself is not proof of transformation. A person can become emotionally open because they are afraid of losing access to someone without actually being prepared to build a healthier relationship. They can miss your presence without understanding how to maintain intimacy. They can fear losing you while still being afraid of truly letting you in. That is why actions matter more than emotional moments. Your attention may have served as a kind of emotional confirmation for them. Knowing that someone cared made them feel significant, even while they kept that person at a distance. When you withdraw, they suddenly have to face what your absence means. And that can awaken something they normally suppress. They may begin wondering whether you have moved on, whether someone else has taken their place,
or whether the emotional connection they once took for granted is permanently gone.
This is where the old cycle can attempt to restart. You pursued. They withdrew. You waited. They returned. You opened your heart. They became overwhelmed and pulled away again. When you finally step out of that pattern, they may reach toward you because the familiar structure has disappeared. Their sudden movement toward you can be less about consciously manipulating you and more about their internal struggle between wanting connection and fearing intimacy. When your absence becomes real, their fear of losing you can temporarily become stronger than their fear of closeness. That may bring out emotions they normally keep buried. But once they feel reassured that you still care, their original defenses can return. The urgency disappears, the warmth fades, and suddenly you are left wondering what happened to the person who seemed so vulnerable only moments ago. This is why you should never confuse someone's temporary emotional reaction with lasting emotional growth. If they truly want to rebuild something with you, look for consistency, look for accountability, look for changed behavior, look for the willingness to communicate, remain present, and tolerate the vulnerability that real intimacy requires. Because your detachment is not supposed to be a strategy for making someone chase you. It is about reclaiming yourself. When you stop choosing chaos over peace, you stop participating in the cycle that kept you emotionally trapped. And if an avoidant person comes back, the question is no longer, how do I make them stay? The question becomes, have they actually changed enough to meet me where I am now? That is the real shift. You no longer need their attention to prove your worth. You no longer need their return to validate the connection. And you no longer have to interpret every emotional gesture as evidence of love. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop feeding the pattern. Let them experience your absence. Let their actions reveal their intentions. And most importantly, let your peace become more important than their uncertainty. Because when you stop caring about controlling the outcome, you finally regain control over your own life. And whether they return or not, that is the part of the story that truly belongs to you. This is Avoidant Heart. Their softness can sometimes become a way of calming themselves, not necessarily because they are trying to deceive you, but because they need reassurance that they still exist somewhere in your emotional world. They want to know they haven't completely disappeared from your mind. The vulnerability they show may be genuine in that moment, but genuine emotion does not always mean genuine transformation. That is what makes their return so confusing. They may not actually be coming back to rebuild the relationship. Sometimes they are simply trying to preserve the emotional connection that once made them feel important. They need to know the bond hasn't completely vanished. Their tenderness becomes a quiet way of checking whether they still have access to your emotions. And that can become another form of control. Not loud control. Not obvious manipulation, something much softer. A message filled with emotion, a memory from the past, a sudden confession, a moment of unexpected warmth. Something that makes you lower your guard and start questioning the boundaries you worked so hard to establish. But sometimes what pulls them back isn't love. It's the discomfort of realizing that your life is continuing without them. When an avoidant notices that they are no longer at the center of your emotional world, something inside them can feel threatened. Your silence becomes meaningful. Your lack of reaction becomes unfamiliar. For so long, they may have assumed that no matter how far they withdrew, you would eventually return. You would explain, you would forgive, you would wait. You would try again. But then something changes. You stop. Your attention no longer moves toward them. You stop trying to decode their silence. You stop proving that you care. And suddenly, they have to face the possibility that your emotional investment is no longer guaranteed. That is when another defense can appear: guilt. Instead of directly confronting their own role in the breakdown, they may say things that quietly make you question yourself. "I didn't think you'd move on that fast. I thought what we had meant more to you. I just needed more time. I know I hurt you, but I was scared." On the surface, these statements can sound vulnerable and innocent, but they can also plant something inside you: doubt. You begin asking yourself whether you were too harsh. Maybe you should have waited longer. Maybe you gave up too soon. Maybe you should have understood them better. And before you realize it, you're carrying emotional responsibility for a situation they helped create. This is where guilt becomes an invisible connection. Even if the relationship is over, guilt can keep you emotionally attached. You may no longer be speaking to them, but you are still thinking about them, still defending your decisions in your own mind, still wondering whether you were wrong. And for someone who struggles with vulnerability, this can be an easier way to maintain significance without having to openly face their own behavior. They may rely on your empathy because they know you naturally try to understand people rather than condemn them. The very compassion that once made you patient with them can become the reason you struggle to fully let go. Notice the timing too. Sometimes they don't reach out when you're falling apart. They reach out when you're finally okay, when you've started accepting reality, when the emotional chaos has quieted down, when you are beginning to feel peaceful again. Then suddenly, a message appears. Maybe it's a memory. Do you remember that night? Maybe it's an apology mixed with an explanation. "I know I hurt you. I just didn't know how to handle what I was feeling." Maybe it's something even simpler that carries emotional weight. "I've been thinking about you." These words can reopen doors you spent months trying to close. And because the emotion may be real, the situation becomes even harder to understand. They may genuinely miss you. They may genuinely feel regret. They may genuinely be afraid of losing you. But missing someone is not the same as being ready to build something healthy with them. That distinction matters. An avoidant person can fear losing you while still fearing intimacy. They can want you close while becoming uncomfortable when closeness actually happens. They can hate the thought of being forgotten while simultaneously creating the distance that pushes you away. So the cycle continues. Dahoma, distance, return, hope, confusion, withdrawal. And when guilt or nostalgia enters the picture, you can become trapped in that cycle without even realizing it. You start questioning your progress. You wonder if letting go was wrong. You begin believing that your boundaries are somehow cruel, simply because they no longer provide them with emotional access. But your decision to detach is not cruelty. Protecting your peace is not punishment. And moving forward does not mean you never cared. Sometimes they use shared guilt as a way to make the ending easier for themselves. If they can convince themselves that both people were equally responsible, they don't have to fully confront how their withdrawal, silence, or emotional unavailability contributed to the fracture. That shared responsibility can become emotionally comforting. It allows them to avoid looking too closely at themselves. And this is why their behavior can feel like emotional fog. You are left trying to figure out what was real, what was fear, what was love, and what was simply a defense mechanism. But there is another important shift that happens when you genuinely detach. The power dynamic changes. For a long time, they may have controlled the rhythm of the relationship. They decided when closeness was allowed. They decided when distance was necessary. You reacted to their movements while they remained protected behind emotional walls. But when you stop reacting, their old strategy loses its effect. Their silence no longer makes you chase. Their withdrawal no longer makes you panic. Their distance no longer determines your emotional state. And that can be deeply uncomfortable for someone who depended on that pattern to feel safe. Their sense of power was never necessarily about controlling your entire life. It was about knowing they could disappear and still be wanted. They could withhold affection and still receive attention. They could create distance and still know you were emotionally available. Once that certainty disappears, they are forced to confront something much more uncomfortable: vulnerability. Their usual defenses stop working because you are no longer participating in the same dance. And this is where mixed signals may begin. A little warmth, then silence. A message, then withdrawal. A moment of affection, then emotional distance again. These contradictions can sometimes be attempts to discover whether they still have an emotional effect on you. If they can still make you question yourself, they know they haven't completely lost their influence. But you don't have to participate.
The goal is not to make them powerless.
The goal is to stop measuring your worth by their behavior. Because a healthy connection doesn't require constant uncertainty. It doesn't need emotional chaos to feel alive. It doesn't depend on one person chasing while the other keeps retreating. If someone truly wants to rebuild with you, their actions will eventually become clearer. They will need to show consistency, accountability, emotional honesty, and a willingness to tolerate real intimacy. Until then, don't mistake emotional intensity for emotional growth. Your peace is not something you owe anyone an explanation for. And when you finally stop dancing to the rhythm of their inconsistency, you discover something important. Their silence only has power over you when you continue giving it meaning.
You may notice something strange when you finally detach. They begin reflecting your behavior. Suddenly, they appear just as distant and unaffected as you are. They may act as though your absence means nothing to them. But sometimes that indifference is simply another layer of protection. Beneath it can be the discomfort of realizing they no longer have the same emotional influence over you. They might even accuse you of changing. You've become cold. You don't care anymore. You aren't the same person. But notice what happens when you hear statements like these. You may start defending yourself. You may feel guilty for finally choosing peace. And the moment you begin questioning whether your boundaries are wrong, you can find yourself pulled back into the same emotional cycle. That is how the old balance can return. The truth is, their need for control may never have been about wanting power over you. It may have been about protecting themselves from the terrifying possibility of needing someone who could eventually leave. Emotional distance gave them a sense of safety. If they never became completely vulnerable, they believed they could never be completely hurt. But when you detach, that protection begins to disappear. You don't take it away by fighting them. You don't take it away by demanding answers. You simply stop participating. And suddenly, they are left without the emotional pattern they once depended on. So they may return to what feels familiar, unpredictability. They can pull you close with unexpected tenderness, make you feel seen again,
and then retreat the moment they sense you becoming emotionally open. They may create warmth and distance in alternating waves, almost as if they are checking whether they can still disturb your emotional balance. But this shift doesn't only happen between you. It can happen inside them as well. Your detachment removes the reflection they once relied on. For so long, your attention, patience, affection, and emotional availability may have helped them feel significant without requiring them to fully confront themselves.
Through your devotion, they could see themselves as wanted. Through your patience, they could feel forgiven. Through your continued presence, they could avoid the fear that they might be unworthy of love. Then you stop, and the mirror goes dark.
Now the silence they once used as protection begins to sound completely different. What once felt like peaceful independence can begin to feel like emptiness. The distance that once made them feel safe may suddenly make them aware of how lonely they actually are. This is where a painful contradiction can emerge. The very intimacy they spent so much time avoiding may be the thing they secretly crave. For years, they may have built their identity around emotional independence. They learned to associate closeness with danger and vulnerability with losing control. Then you entered their life and became both comfort and threat. They wanted your warmth, but your emotional depth frightened them. They appreciated your consistency, but your consistency also exposed how inconsistent they were. Your love showed them parts of themselves they had kept hidden for years, the part that wanted connection, belonging, trust, and emotional safety. And sometimes, that is exactly what makes them pull away. The more clearly you see someone, the harder it becomes for them to hide from themselves. Your care may have reminded them of wounds they didn't know how to process. So instead of moving closer, they created distance. Not necessarily because they felt nothing, but because feeling deeply forced them into territory they didn't know how to navigate. But then something changes when you stop caring. The distraction disappears. There is no longer someone constantly offering reassurance. No one is waiting for their return. No one is trying to decode their silence. And suddenly, they have more space to hear their own thoughts. At first, they may try to fill that space with anything they can control. Work, routine, friends, new connections, entertainment, constant activity. Anything that keeps them from sitting alone with what they feel. But distractions cannot permanently replace emotional awareness. Because what they lost wasn't simply your presence. They lost the reflection your presence created. Your attention once gave them a certain image of themselves. They could feel important because someone cared. They could feel desirable because someone wanted them. They could avoid confronting their emptiness because your emotional investment filled some of that space. When that reflection disappears, they may suddenly feel lost without understanding why. They may wonder why their usual routines don't feel satisfying anymore, why they feel restless, why the silence seems heavier, why the person they assumed would always be there has finally stopped reaching. And this can create the temptation to return. They may send a message. They may suddenly appear more emotional. They may behave as though they finally realized what they lost. But you have to look beyond the moment. Are they returning because they are ready to build something healthier, or because they need the old emotional mirror back? Those are two completely different things. Someone can miss how you made them feel without being prepared to become the person you needed them to be. They can crave your presence without understanding how to sustain intimacy. They can fear losing you while still being afraid of getting close. That is the tragedy of the avoidant cycle. They move toward connection when loneliness becomes unbearable, then retreat when intimacy becomes overwhelming. They seek closeness and then fear the very closeness they sought. They run from intimacy because it exposes them. Then they run back toward intimacy because distance exposes their loneliness. And the cycle continues. But when you genuinely detach, you interrupt that pattern. You stop being responsible for regulating their emotions. You stop being the person who constantly reassures them that they matter.
You stop trying to rescue them from feelings they need to learn how to face themselves.
Some may respond by trying harder to pull you back into their emotional orbit. Others may disappear even further into isolation. But either way, something important has changed. You are no longer carrying the relationship by yourself. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson your detachment can reveal. You show them a form of love that doesn't chase, a form of love that doesn't beg, a form of love that doesn't sacrifice peace just to maintain a connection. Your silence isn't revenge. Your distance isn't punishment. Your boundaries are simply evidence that you have stopped abandoning yourself to keep someone else comfortable. And if they truly reflect on what happened, they may eventually recognize what their behavior cost them. Not because you forced them to learn, Not because you made them regret losing you, but because your absence removed the distraction. The guilt, sudden tenderness, nostalgia, mixed signals, and attempts to pull you back into emotional chaos may all come from fear. Fear of being forgotten, fear of being replaced, fear of confronting themselves without the reassurance your love once provided. But their fear is not your responsibility to carry. Your job is not to become their emotional mirror again. Your job is to keep looking honestly at yourself. Because when you stop chasing someone who keeps running, you don't simply end a relationship pattern, you reveal it. And eventually, the deepest truth becomes impossible to ignore. The greatest distance was never truly between you and them. It was the distance they had created within themselves.